The wind was blowing hard across the high desert when Elias Redhawk realized something was wrong. He had ridden this trail between Winslow and his ranch for more years than he cared to count, and nothing on it ever surprised him anymore. The broken fence post, the dried creek bed, the lone juniper leaning as though it were tired of being a tree. But the shape lying on the side of the dusty road wasn't supposed to be there. At first he thought it was a dead calf. The color was right brown, unmoving, but calves didn't cry. And what he heard wasn't the wind either. It was thin, weak, a sound that didn't belong in the emptiness of late afternoon. A baby. Elias kicked his bay gelding into a faster trot. The sun was dropping behind the mesas, throwing long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the road. As he drew closer, he made out a woman, a young one collapsed in the dust. Her hair hung in a black tangle, her dress torn and stiff with dirt. In her arms, a baby cried the kind of cry a man hears only when a child is too tired to keep fighting. Elias reined in slowly. Skittish folks spooked easy, and this one looked like she'd break apart if a breeze touched her wrong. "Ma'am," he called. No answer. Her head lifted just barely, and he saw the fear in her eyes. Not ordinary fear, this was the kind that carried days of running behind it. She tried to stand, but fell again, curling around the baby, as though she could shield him from the sun itself. Elias swung down from his horse, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you." He moved closer, boots crunching through gravel. "But that baby needs water." She whispered something in Spanish, voice raw, cracked. "Agua, por favor." "I got water," he said. He unslung his canteen and knelt beside her. Her fingers trembled as she took it. She drank too fast, coughing, then tried to get some into the baby's mouth. Most of it spilled down his cheeks. The boy's eyes were nearly rolling back. Heat had gotten to him. Maybe too long without milk, too long without shade, too long without hope. "How long you been out here?" Elias asked quietly. She shook her head like she didn't know anymore. He scanned the empty road, the dusty horizon, the tracks that led exactly nowhere. Whoever left her here didn't intend for her to survive. He looked back at her skin, burned lips, cracked arms, shaking from exhaustion. But even now she kept the baby tucked close as though nothing else mattered. There was something in that. Something that tugged at a place he thought had died years ago. "Ma'am," Elias said gently, "you need to stand. Both of you won't last much longer." She tried. Her knees buckled. That was when he said it, words that came out harsher than he intended, but truth had a way of being sharp. "If you don't stand up, that baby won't see another sunset." Her breath hitched. She clutched the child tighter, pushed against the ground again, and this time almost made it to her feet before she stumbled into Elias. He caught her easily. She was lighter than she looked, too light. "I can put you both on horseback," he said. "My ranch is half a mile from here. There's shade, water, a roof." She stiffened at the word ranch, like she'd been betrayed by someone who lived on land once. He didn't press. Hurt didn't need explaining. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Isabel," she whispered. "And this is Tomas." "All right, Isabel. I'm Elias Redhawk." He lifted Tomas, first careful, gentle, then helped Isabel into the saddle. She swayed, clutching her son, and Elias steadied her leg. "You fall asleep on me, I'll rope you to the saddle. Just a warning." For a moment, something nearly like a smile trembled on her lips, but exhaustion swallowed it before it reached her eyes. Elias started walking, leading the horse toward the faint outline of his ranch, the one place in the Arizona backcountry where silence didn't feel hostile. The sky deepened into a bruised purple. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the distance. Isabel's grip on Tomas loosened for a second, and Elias reached up to support the baby. "He's breathing," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring, her or himself. As they reached the ranch yard, the last light of day caught the weathered boards of the barn and the small house Elias had built with his own 2 hands. Once, years ago, it had been meant for more than one person. Now it felt like a place waiting for something he didn't dare name. Inside, he pushed the door open with his shoulder and guided Isabel toward the bed. She collapsed onto it, still clutching Tomas. Elias lit a lamp, checked the baby's forehead, and felt fear he hadn't felt since losing his wife. "Fever," he muttered. "Bad one." Isabel's eyes filled with panic. "Please, no doctor. We don't need a doctor." Elias reached for his coat. "We need Maggie 2 Elk. She knows desert fevers better than anyone." He saddled his horse again and rode hard toward the Navajo settlement. When Maggie arrived an hour later, Tomas's breathing had turned shallow. Maggie knelt beside the baby. Her hands were steady, her voice soft. "He's weak, but not gone." She mixed herbs, checked pulse, sighed. "This woman, you found her on the road." "Yes," Elias said. "She's carrying more wounds than the sun can burn." Maggie looked at him sharply. "You planning to help her pass tonight?" Elias didn't answer right away. He glanced at Isabel, half asleep, still clutching Tomas, even in exhaustion. "I don't leave folks to die," he finally said. Maggie nodded once. "Then tomorrow will test you more than tonight." Hours passed. Isabel woke several times, startled, whispering Spanish prayers over her child. Elias sat on the porch, leaning against a post, listening to the desert breathe in the darkness. The weight of responsibility settled onto him, unexpected, heavy, but not unwelcome. Somewhere before dawn, Tomas let out a stronger cry. Maggie emerged with a tired smile. "He'll make it." Relief washed over Isabel so violently she broke into quiet sobs. Elias looked away, giving her the dignity of her tears. When morning light spilled through the window, Isabel watched Elias from the bed, watched the way he moved quietly, respectfully, as though her presence didn't inconvenience him. Most men she'd met acted like kindness cost too much. This one behaved like it was just a thing you did. She didn't trust it. Not yet. But she couldn't ignore it either. Elias poured water into a tin cup and glanced her way. "He's through the worst of it," he said softly. "You both are safe now." Safe. The word hit her like a bruise touched too soon. As Isabel lay back, Tomas asleep on her chest, she whispered, "Why? Why would you help a stranger?" Elias paused in the doorway. He studied her for a long moment. Her fear, her exhaustion, and beneath it all, a stubborn will to survive. "'Cause somebody ought to," he said simply. But the truth was deeper, running through him like a river he'd crossed too many times. He didn't say it yet. Maybe he didn't fully know it himself. As he stepped out onto the porch, he noticed the clouds building in the east. A storm coming, the kind that shifted more than just weather. And tomorrow, Isabel Morales would learn that surviving the desert was only the beginning. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke and clean cotton. Morning light stretched across the floorboards, catching on the corner of a woven rug and the edge of the old iron stove where a kettle murmured low and steady. Isabel opened her eyes slowly, carefully, like someone waking from a nightmare only half escaped. She was still here. Tomas lay curled beside her, one small hand fisted near his mouth. His breathing was deeper now, peaceful in a way it hadn't been for days. She touched his forehead with the back of her hand, warm, not burning. Relief ached in her chest. Elias stood across the room, pouring water into a metal basin. His shoulders were wide under a faded chambray shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow arms, marked with old scars and sun-darkened skin. He didn't speak, just nodded once when he saw she was awake and turned back to the stove. She sat up wincing as the soreness in her legs reminded her she hadn't slept in a real bed in weeks, or eaten a full meal, or felt this stillness, this absence of fear. "I'll fix something to eat," Elias said without turning around. "I can cook," she said quickly, voice raspier than she meant it to be. "You can rest." He poured cornmeal into a pot. "We'll trade jobs tomorrow. I'm not here to be waited on." He paused, then looked over his shoulder. His expression was calm but unreadable. "I ain't asking for anything, ma'am, but I am offering something." The words hit her in a way she couldn't explain. Not gentle, not sweet, but true. She bit back the first reply that came to her lips, too proud, too practiced, and nodded instead. He turned back to the stove. As the corn mush cooked, the scent filled the room, mingling with the sharp scent of coffee. Her stomach twisted with hunger, but she held still, eyes fixed on Tomas. "I thought he was going to die," she said finally. "So did I," Elias replied. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was something else. Something like shared ground. A thin bridge, but a bridge all the same. After they ate, Elias carried a bucket out to the well, while Isabel cleaned the bowls. She found clean cloths folded in a cabinet and used one to wipe Tomas's face. He woke cranky and confused, but when he saw her, he smiled weakly and reached for her braid. "Hola, mi amor," she whispered, kissing his head. "You're okay now." From outside, a woman's voice called out. Not loud, not urgent. Familiar, though Isabel couldn't place it. Elias opened the door a moment later, standing aside to let in a tall Navajo woman in a long skirt and beaded necklace. Her gray hair was braided down her back, and her eyes missed nothing. "Maggie Two Elk," Elias said simply. "The one who saved your son." Isabel stood quickly, unsure what to do. "Gracias. Thank you." Maggie nodded, stepping inside and setting a small pouch on the table. "Tea herbs. Fever's broken, but it could come back. Weak children don't fight clean battles." Isabel took the pouch with both hands. "I know how to brew it." Maggie studied her for a moment. "You from Sonora?" Isabel hesitated. "Yes." "From Hermosillo?" Maggie's gaze softened just slightly. "Desert folk. We know what hard looks like." Elias didn't speak. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the two women like they were speaking a language he didn't need to interrupt. "I should go," Maggie said after a while. She turned to Elias. "You'll need to come by the settlement tomorrow." "What for? Talk's starting." Her look was pointed. A white-passing Navajo rancher, bringing home a Mexican woman and a half-dead baby. It makes for loud mouths. "I'm not asking their permission," Elias said flatly. "You never do." She reached out and touched his arm briefly. "But you'll need allies this time." When she left the room, felt colder somehow. Isabel didn't meet Elias's eyes. She knew that look people gave her, she'd seen it before. Back in Hermosillo when she began showing. At the mission when she asked for bread. Even from the driver who dumped her and Tomas by the roadside like garbage. "They'll think," she started, but Elias cut her off gently. "They can think what they want. I know what I saw." She nodded again. "Not quite thanks. Not quite trust. But something between the two." Later that day, she stepped outside with Tomas on her hip. The air smelled of mesquite and old earth. Wind tugged at her hair. She walked around the house slowly, careful of her steps, and found Elias repairing a fence rail that had splintered in the last storm. He glanced up but didn't stop working. "Sun feels good today." She nodded. "I thought I'd never feel it again." He drove a nail into the wood with 2 firm strikes. "That baby, he made it through 'cause you didn't quit." Her throat tightened. "I was ready to. I was ready to lie down and let it all go. You didn't." She looked down at Tomas, who was reaching for the silver buttons on her shirt. "No. Because of him." Elias straightened, wiped his hands on his jeans, and studied her for a long moment. "You got somewhere you need to be?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nowhere safe." He nodded slowly. "Then you can stay here. Until you find your feet. And then that's up to you." That night Isabel didn't sleep in her dress. She found a flannel shirt folded neatly in a trunk by the bed and changed into it. The cloth was soft, worn from years of washing. She tucked Tomas into the blankets, then lay beside him, staring at the dark ceiling above. She thought of her father, of Raúl, of the whispered insults and the nights sleeping on dirt floors, of the men who offered help with one hand and reached with the other. Elias hadn't reached for anything. She turned toward the window where moonlight stretched across the floor like a passant. Maybe for the first time in her life there was no price. Out on the porch, Elias sat in his rocking chair, rifle resting across his knees. Not for her, for what might come looking. Behind him, the desert sighed and the stars burned low. And in the cabin, a woman who had trusted no one in months fell into the first real sleep she'd had since her life fell apart. Tomorrow she'd wake up in a house that wasn't hers, cared for by a man who owed her nothing. And sooner or later, she'd have to decide what to do with that kind of kindness. Because kindness, she was starting to realize, was just another kind of danger. The sun rose slow and orange over the canyon ridge, casting long shadows across the pasture fence. Elias Redhawk stood at the edge of the corral, one boot braced against the bottom rail, watching his bay gelding nose the dirt for scraps of hay. The world was quiet, save for the wind moving like a sigh through the junipers. He liked it best this way, quiet, predictable, the kind of morning where nothing hurt unless you looked too far back. He spat into the dust and adjusted his gloves. The old corner post had split again. He'd need to reinforce it before the next storm. That post had held through 2 flash floods, 3 brush fires, and 1 land dispute that damn near ended in gunfire. It had not, however, survived a woman and her child being dropped into his life. He turned back toward the house and saw Isabel at the kitchen window, her dark hair tied back, her face half lit by the pale morning light. She wasn't moving, just standing there, with her hands on either side of the sink, watching him like she couldn't decide whether he was safe or stupid. He knew that look. He'd seen it before. It was the same look his wife had worn in the first weeks after he came back from war. The same look a horse gives when it's not sure whether the fence is a boundary or a trap. Isabel stepped out onto the porch a moment later with Tomas in her arms. The boy was chewing on a piece of cornbread and grinning like he hadn't almost died 2 nights ago. Elias nodded toward the corral. "You ever fix a fence?" She frowned slightly. "No." "Well," he said, slapping his gloves together, "you're about to learn." He didn't ask why she followed him out there. Maybe she was curious. Maybe she didn't want to be alone in the house. Or maybe, like him, she was more comfortable with the feel of wood and wire than with words. They worked in silence. Elias showed her how to hold the rail steady while he drove the nails. Her hands were smaller but strong. She didn't complain when a splinter caught her palm, or when the sun rose high enough to burn the tops of her cheeks. When the post finally stood firm, Elias stepped back and squinted at the sky. A hawk circled high above the ridge. "Scars don't make you dangerous," he said after a long silence. "They just mean you survived." Isabel looked up at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "That what you tell yourself?" He shrugged. "Used to. Do they still hurt only when I stop moving?" She lowered her eyes to the baby on her hip. "I got more scars than skin some days. Then I reckon you've survived a hell of a lot." The wind picked up, tugging at her skirt. She turned toward the ridge where the sun lit the stones red gold, and the cactus cast sharp shadows across the dust. "You live out here all by yourself?" "Mostly. No family, none that matter." She gave him a look. "That sounds like a story. Some stories ain't worth telling twice." She let it drop, but he could feel her still thinking, measuring him. They walked back toward the cabin. Tomas had fallen asleep against her shoulder, a smudge of dust on his cheek. Elias opened the door for her, waited until she stepped through, then closed it behind them. The house smelled of coffee and clean sweat and desert air. It smelled like someone lived here now. He sat at the table and poured 2 mugs. Isabel hesitated before sitting. When she finally did, she cradled the warm mug like it was something breakable. "Your wife," she said softly. "She's gone." Elias nodded. 10 years. Children know. She looked down. "I was promised to someone. Raul. He said he loved me. Then he told my father I seduced him. Left me after." "My father—" She swallowed. "My father said I shamed the family. He made me leave." Elias didn't flinch. Didn't judge, just waited. "I thought maybe Raul would change. That he'd come find us. But he didn't." Her voice cracked low and bitter. "Men always leave." "I haven't." She looked up sharply, eyes searching his. Why Elias didn't answer right away. He took a sip of his coffee, staring into the grain of the wood beneath his hands. Finally he said, "Because I don't leave what's mine to guard." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just full, like air before rain. Tomas stirred, fussing in his sleep. Isabel rose to soothe him, humming something in Spanish under her breath. Elias watched her, something tightening in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Later that afternoon, Elias hitched the wagon and headed into town. He needed supplies, and word was bound to be spreading. People talked when a man brought a stranger home, especially one with a baby and a name nobody recognized. He left Isabel with a rifle, showed her how to use it. She didn't blink once at the weight in her hands. "I've shot before," she said quietly. "My uncle had chickens." He smiled faintly. "I don't think the chickens shot back." She didn't smile back. The ride into town was dusty quiet and longer than usual. Elias felt the eyes on him the moment he reached the general store. A woman with pin-curled hair whispered something behind a gloved hand. One of the ranch hands from Thorne's place muttered loud enough for Elias to hear, "Guess Red Hawk's gone soft. Picking up strays now." Elias didn't answer, just loaded what he needed, tipped his hat, and rode out. Back at the ranch, Isabel was chopping carrots for stew. Tomas was crawling across the floor, following the shadow of the rocking chair. Elias dropped the sack of flour by the counter and said, "Town's noticed. I guessed they would." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "I can send word to Maggie. Maybe she'll speak for you at council if things get noisy." "I don't need anyone to speak for me," Isabel said, but her voice trembled. Elias tilted his head. Everyone needs someone. That night, he fixed the hinges on the barn while Isabel bathed Tomas in a tin basin. The boy giggled when she poured water over his belly. It echoed into the twilight like a sound too innocent for the harshness of this land. Elias watched them from a distance, lit only by the last flare of dusk. Something in his chest cracked open, slow and quiet, like a door that hadn't been touched in years. He remembered what Maggie said. This woman, you found her on the road. She's carrying more wounds than the sun can burn. And still, here she was, healing, or trying. Elias turned back to his tools and didn't look up again until long after the stars came out. Tomorrow would bring more whispers, more questions, and maybe something else too. Because healing, he knew, wasn't just a matter of surviving. It was choosing to stay, choosing to rebuild, even when the boards were cracked, even when the fence never quite stood straight. The morning came in quietly, like it was testing the ground before setting foot. A soft haze hung over the low hills behind the ranch, casting a golden wash over the barn, the corral, and the worn trail that wound its way down toward the valley. Inside the cabin, Isabel was shelling beans at the kitchen table, her fingers moving slowly, rhythmically, as if the motion could distract her from the question she'd been circling for days. Why was he helping her? Tomas was asleep again, a rare stretch of rest, his fever still low but no longer threatening. Maggie's herbs had worked, and so had the quiet. The lack of raised voices demands hunger, fear. That silence was Elias's doing, not just his words, but his way. He moved through the house like a shadow you trusted. She had trusted shadows before. They had teeth. The screen door creaked open, and Elias stepped inside, brushing dust from his shirt. He smelled of horse sun and the faint wood smoke of the morning's fire. He poured himself a glass of water, drank half, then leaned against the counter, watching her without saying a word. She didn't look up. You always this quiet? He shrugged. Talk and don't make work get done faster. You don't ask many questions either. I figure if a person wants to tell me something, they will. When they're ready. She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Her hands stilled over the bowl of beans. I need to ask you something now, he said. Her shoulders tensed. She looked up slowly like a rabbit sniffing the air for danger. What is it? Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, elbows resting on the table. His gaze was steady, not soft, not hard, just real. Marry me, he said, and I'll take care of you both. No promises, just truth. Isabel stared at him. For a second, she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. The words landed like iron dropped on wood, solid, sudden, not dressed in romance or flattery. Her throat tightened. Is this a joke? No, ma'am. Why would you say that? You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you fought for that boy. I know you didn't leave him behind even when your legs gave out. I know you've been watching every corner of this house like it might turn on you. She said nothing. Her jaw clenched. I don't want anything from you, he went on. This ain't about me getting a woman in the house. This is about making sure Tomas has a roof and a future, and that you don't keep waiting for the next bad thing to find you. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping back behind her. Her voice trembled. You think I'd say yes to that, like some charity, like I owe you now? No, Elias said simply. I'm saying you don't owe me. That's the whole point. Isabel turned her back to him, but walked to the sink and gripped the edge with both hands. Her heart pounded, every nerve on fire. She stared out at the dusty yard, at the wind tugging at the dry grass. It was too much, too sudden, too dangerous. Marriage meant giving someone the power to hurt you. She'd done that once. Her father, Raoul. Even the nuns at the mission who had fed her bread with one hand and judgment with the other. And yet, Elias hadn't touched her once without permission. He hadn't looked at her like a problem to solve or a burden to carry. He had fed her, helped her, protected her, and asked for nothing. Nothing until now. Behind her he stood. His voice was low even. "I'll be out in the field. Think on it." The door clicked shut behind him. She stayed at the window for a long time, staring into the empty morning. Her arms trembled, her breath uneven. She didn't cry. She'd cried enough. That night she sat on the edge of the bed watching Tomas sleep, one hand on his chest. His skin was cooler now, his lips pink again. He looked stronger, fuller, like a boy with more than just survival ahead of him. "Would it be so terrible," she whispered in Spanish, "if I gave him a name with roots in the ground?" She looked around the room, Elias's room. The walls were plain. The bed was simple. The shelves held only books, tools, and a single worn photograph turned face down. She didn't touch it. At some point, the door creaked open. Elias stepped inside, pausing in the doorway, like he wasn't sure he should enter. She stood up slowly, bare feet pressing into the rug. Her voice was soft, almost unsure. "You meant what you said, I don't talk to hear myself." She nodded once. Her fingers tightened at her sides. "I'll do it," she said. Elias blinked. "You sure know," she admitted. "But I know you won't hurt him. Or me. That's more than I've had in a long time." He didn't smile. Just looked at her with something like respect, maybe gratitude, maybe a shared understanding that this wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something real. The next morning, Maggie arrived early. Elias had sent word before sunrise. She said yes, he told her. Maggie raised one brow. "You told her what it would mean, how people will talk." "She already knows." Maggie nodded. "Then we'll do it simple. Fire. Water. Vows. No audience." Isabel stood by the stove, holding Tomas, silent as the desert outside. But her eyes met Elias's, and she didn't look away. That afternoon, they stood beneath the cottonwood by the well. Maggie lit, Sage spoke the old words, then the new ones. Elias gave Isabel a silver band that had once belonged to his mother. She said nothing, only slipped it on her hand, trembling. Tomas fussed as the sun dipped low. Elias reached out slowly, and she let him take the boy. Tomas stared at him with wide eyes, then curled into his chest, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That night they shared a home not as guests and hosts, but as something else. Not quite husband and wife, not yet a family. But something had begun. Isabel slept lightly, one arm always draped over Tomas. In the next room, Elias sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, the steady rasp of steel against stone, filling the silence. He wasn't sure what this would turn into. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't preparing to be alone anymore. And outside, just beyond the pasture fence, the wind carried voices from the ridge, whispers of a stranger on Thorn's land asking questions. A man with sharp boots and a familiar smirk. The wind shifted around noon, dry and sharp like it had teeth. Dust blew in from the east, curling in lazy spirals across the ranch yard. Elias felt at first something in the way the horses in the corral stirred ears, twitching heads lifting. The kind of stillness that came before trouble. He was oiling the hinges on the barn door when he heard the slow creak of saddle leather and the soft clop of a single horse approaching. He didn't look up right away. Only one man rode like that, too casual for someone just passing through. Caleb Thorne. Elias set the oil can down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and turned to face the man trotting into his yard like he owned the damn dirt. Red Hawk Caleb drawled, sliding down from his saddle, with a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. "Heard you had yourself some company." Elias didn't answer. Just studied him, tall, lean, dressed in too clean denim and a spotless hat that screamed more barroom than backcountry. The kind of man who never fixed his own fence but sure as hell had opinions about how yours should look. Caleb tipped his head toward the cabin. That her inside the gal folks have been whisperin' about Elias's jaw tensed. "You got business, say it. Easy, friend. Just neighborly curiosity. Heard she was real pretty, that's all. Thought I'd come see for myself." Before Elias could respond, the cabin door opened. Isabel stepped out onto the porch, Tomas on her hip. She froze when she saw the stranger. Her eyes flicked to Elias, searching for something, permission maybe, or a signal. Caleb grinned. "Well, I'll be. That's her damn Elias. Didn't think you had the charm for a woman like that." Elias stepped forward, planting himself between Caleb and the porch. "You've seen enough." Caleb held up his hands in mock surrender. "Ain't meanin' no harm. Just sayin' what half the town's already whisperin'. A Mexican girl, a baby that ain't yours. Folks get nervous about who's settlin' down where." Elias didn't move. "And you always ride out to share town gossip in person." Caleb smiled wider, but there was no warmth in it. "Only when it gets real interesting." He mounted up, reins in hand. "You take care now. Would be a shame if something happened to that pretty little home you're buildin'." The threat wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. He rode off slow, making sure Isabel saw the way he looked at her, like she was something hanging in a butcher's window. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat out on the porch with his rifle across his lap, boots planted firm. The sky stretched wide and indifferent above him, stars scattered like broken glass. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled. Isabel came out after midnight barefoot, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "You think he'll come back?" she asked. Elias didn't look at her. He never really left. She sat beside him, pulling the blanket tighter. "You know him well enough to know he wants what don't belong to him." She was quiet for a while. That's the kind of man Raoul was. Elias said nothing. She glanced at him, voice low. "Why don't you just send me away?" He turned his head, finally meeting her eyes. "Because you're not the problem." In the early hours of morning, Elias finally went inside. He bolted the door behind them. Just before dawn, a thick, acrid smell yanked him out of sleep. Smoke. He bolted upright, heart-pounding, and raced to the window. The barn was on fire. Flames licked the sky, wild and orange, crackling through the dry wood like paper. The horses were screaming. "Stay inside," he shouted at Isabel, grabbing his boots and rifle as he ran. The air outside was already choking, the heat savage. He threw open the barn doors and shouted the horses' names, grabbing halters, untying ropes, slapping flanks. One by one, the animals bolted out into the open field, coughing and rearing, wild-eyed. The last horse, his father's old roan, was tangled in the back stall. Elias dove in, eyes burning, lungs on fire, and cut the rope with his knife. The horse stumbled free just as the roof collapsed behind them. Elias rolled in the dirt, coughing black smoke from his chest, his shirt singed at the sleeve. Isabel was at his side in seconds, eyes wide with panic. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine." He waved her off, still wheezing. "Get Tomas inside. Keep the windows shut." She hesitated. "Now, Isabel." She obeyed, scooping up the child and disappearing into the cabin. Elias turned to watch what was left of the barn crumble into itself, embers rising like fireflies into the dawn. By noon, what wasn't ash had been stomped out. The corral stood empty, the air thick with the stink of smoke and ruin. Maggie rode out when word reached her. She stood next to Elias at the edge of the wreckage. "You know who did this?" she asked. He nodded once. "I got a guess. Caleb. He came sniffing around yesterday." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "You gonna go to the sheriff?" Elias didn't answer right away. "No proof." "There never is." She looked toward the house where Isabel rocked Tomas beside the window. "You let this escalate," Maggie said, voice hard, "and you won't just lose a barn, you'll lose everything." That night, Isabel helped Elias clean his burned forearm in the kitchen. Her hands were gentle, more confident than he expected. She'd done this before, he realized. Nursed someone through worse. "He's not gonna stop, is he?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "Not unless he's forced to." She finished bandaging the wound, then sat across from him, candlelight flickering in her dark eyes. "What are you gonna do?" Elias looked down at the old wooden table, scratched, scarred, solid. "Build again," he said. "Stronger this time." She nodded slowly. "I'll help." The words caught him off guard. "You sure?" She looked at him steadily. "This is my home now, too. If it burns, I'll be here to put it out." Outside, the wind shifted again, cooler this time, a whisper of something new riding on the air. But in the hills above, Caleb Thorne lit a cigarette with a burnt match and stared down at the ranch through narrowed eyes. "You want to burn witches?" he muttered. "Then bring fire." He flicked the match into the dirt and ground it out with his boot. The dust was still settling from the fire when Koa Redhawk rode in. He came down the ridge at a slow trot, horse-snorting coat, flecked with the red dust of canyon trails. From the porch, Elias recognized him. Before he saw his face, same squared shoulders, same upright spine, same silence stretching out ahead like a warning. Koa hadn't set foot on this land in 3 years. The fact that he chose today to show up meant one thing he'd heard. Elias stepped off the porch and met his cousin halfway to the gate. Koa dismounted without a word. He tied his reins to the post, like he still had claim to the place. "You smell like ash," Koa said flatly. "Lost the barn. I heard." Koa's eyes flicked to the house. "And I heard why." Elias didn't blink. "You here to help or add to the noise?" "That depends," Koa said, stepping forward, boots grinding into the gravel. "You planning to keep this up?" Elias crossed his arms. "Keep what up this crusade? Sheltering a woman you don't know, raising a child that ain't yours, giving Thorne every excuse he needs to rile up half the county." Elias didn't respond right away. His silence stretched long, sharp, and heavy. "She's my wife," he said finally, "and the boy is under my roof. That don't change how people see it. I'm not asking them to." Koa gave a short, bitter laugh. "You never did care much for other folks' views, but this isn't just about you now. They're dragging our name through the mud, whispering that Red Hawk blood's mixed with Mexican, that we're harboring illegals, thieves, worse." Elias stepped closer, voice low and steady. "Let them whisper. We know what's true." Koa's jaw clenched. "The council's called a gathering. Tomorrow. Out at Dry Rock. They want answers. They'll get 'em." "Don't bring her," Koa said, jerking his chin toward the house. "You know how they'll look at her. How they'll treat the boy." Elias didn't answer. Koa lowered his voice. "We come from warriors, Eli. but you're choosing to die on the wrong hill. Elias met his eyes. No. I'm choosing the right people. Koa held the stare for a long beat, then exhaled and looked away. Then be ready. They'll come at you swinging. He mounted up, turned the horse without another word, and rode back the way he came. That night, Elias told Isabel about the gathering. She was rocking Tomas near the hearth, eyes half-focused on the fire. They'll want to see you, he said quietly. Judge with their own eyes. I can tell them no keep you here. She shook her head. I'm tired of hiding. It won't be easy. It never has been. She looked down at Tomas and ran her fingers through his soft black hair. I'd rather stand beside someone who sees me than behind someone who's ashamed of me. Elias nodded, but worry pulled at his features. They'll test you. Look for weakness. I've lived through worse than their looks. He studied her in the firelight, and for the first time saw not just strength, but resolve. Something that couldn't be burned out even by fire. The next morning, the three of them rode out at dawn. Elias had borrowed a wagon from a neighbor, Tomas wrapped in blankets between them. The road to dry rock twisted through canyon scrub and high desert, the sun slow to rise behind the red stone bluffs. When they arrived, a small crowd was already gathered, tribal elders, ranchers, townsfolk. Maggie. 2 elk stood near the fire pit, arms crossed, face unreadable. Koa was beside her. As Elias helped Isabel down, heads turned. Some whispered, others stared openly. Isabel stood tall, Tomas on her hip, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. They walked forward together. An elder named Joseph Littlecloud raised a hand. His face was lined with years and wind. His voice carried like a river moving over rock. Elias Redhawk, you bring outsiders to council. Explain. Elias stood straight. This is my wife, Isabel. Her child, Tomas, lives under my roof, eats from my hand, and is protected by my word. A murmur ran through the group. Joseph glanced at the boy. Not your blood. No, Elias said. But that don't make him less mine. Another man, Ben Strongwater, stepped forward. Why should we suffer the weight of Thorn's anger for your choices? He's already burned your barn. Next, he'll burn the rest of us. I never asked you to carry my fire, Elias said calmly. I only ask you not to feed it. He's not one of us, Ben shot back, pointing at Tomas. His bloodline ends at the border. Isabel stepped forward, voice clear and strong. His bloodline includes every mile I walked to keep him alive. Every night I prayed without answer. Every bruise, every scar, every name I've been called. You want to measure him by blood, then measure mine. Silence followed. Maggie broke it. I say this, she said, stepping into the circle. I've seen men leave children to die and called it God's will. I've seen Elias do the opposite. That boy is alive because Elias chose him, and because this woman refused to give up. Joseph looked from Maggie to Isabel to Elias. Then he nodded once. You've made your stand, he said. Let the rest decide if they stand with you. They rode home just before dusk. The wagon was quiet. Isabel held Tomas close, his small hand curled into her coat. You think it mattered? She asked. Elias kept his eyes on the road. Some hearts changed today. Some hardened. That's always how it goes. He glanced at her. But we didn't stand alone. Back at the ranch, they found the fence mended. Koa's horse was gone, but a length of fresh timber had been laid by the gate. A quiet gesture. No words. That night, Elias stood on the porch, rifle beside him, watching the moon rise. Isabel stepped up beside him, blanket draped over her shoulders. You think Thorne's finished? Elias shook his head. He just got started. She nodded. Then we hold fast. He looked at her, then at the child she carried. Sometimes, he said, voice low, family ain't what you're born into. It's what you refuse to walk away from. Inside, the fire burned slow and steady. And out in the darkness, Thorne was planning his next move this time, not with fire, but with papers and law. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, dusty from the trail, but crisp in its contents. The sheriff himself brought it hat in hand, avoiding Elias's eyes as he handed it over on the porch. He muttered something about just doing his job before riding off without another word. Elias stood with the letter in one hand, the weight of it heavier than the paper should allow. Isabel stepped into the doorway, brushing flour from her hands, her apron still tied from breakfast. What is it? He handed it to her without a word. She read slowly. Her fingers trembled. When she looked up, her face had gone pale. He's claiming Tomas. Elias nodded. He filed a petition. Claims he's the boy's father. Wants custody. Isabel's voice dropped to a whisper. He can't, he's lying. He doesn't care. She stared down at the paper again. But there's no proof. No blood test. No birth certificate. Elias stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. He doesn't need truth. He just needs doubt. A judge, especially one who owes him favors, might give it. Her mouth went dry. He's doing this because I stood up at council. He's doing it because you said no. And because he knows taking Tomas would break you. That night, Isabel sat by the fire long after Tomas had fallen asleep. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her body tight with fury and fear. This is how they punish you, she said softly. They don't burn your house. They take what you love. Elias crouched beside her. Then we fight back. You can't fight a judge with a rifle. No, he said. But you can fight with the truth. She looked at him, eyes blazing. What truth? That I was a fool who trusted the wrong man, that I fled with a child born out of wedlock and landed in the arms of another stranger that doesn't play well in a courtroom. You didn't land, Elias said firmly. You survived. There's a difference. A week later, they stood outside the courthouse in Red Mesa. The building was squat, sandstone bricked, and surrounded by men who stared too long at Isabel and too hard at Elias. Inside, the courtroom smelled like paper and sweat. Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table, clean-shaven and smug, his lawyer sharp-suited and smiling like a snake. Isabel refused to look at him. Elias sat beside her, his presence steady, his arm lightly brushing hers. The judge was an older man named Creel, known for two things, his dislike of scandal and his deep ties to the old landowners. Thorne had bought this fight in advance. Creel adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file in front of him. Mr. Thorne, your claim is that the child Tomas is biologically yours, yes, sir, Thorne said smoothly. His mother and I were involved. When I found out she'd run off with my child, I acted quickly. Isabel stood abruptly. He's lying. Creel raised a hand. You'll have your turn, ma'am. Thorne's lawyer stood straightening his tie. We have sworn statements from two witnesses who saw the boy's mother leave Thorne's property 6 months ago. We also have a petition requesting a paternity test. Elias leaned in. You don't have to do this. Isabel stood slowly. Yes, I do. She walked to the center of the courtroom facing the judge without trembling. I did work for the Thorne Ranch, she said. For 2 weeks, I cleaned rooms and washed dishes. Caleb Thorne made advances. I said no. He cornered me once, tried to take what he wasn't offered. I escaped. I never looked back. Creel frowned. You're claiming assault. No, sir. I'm claiming he's a liar. Do you have proof the child isn't his? No. Just the truth. Then this court must consider. He doesn't want the boy, she said, cutting him off. He wants revenge. Tomas is a pawn to him. A way to punish me and maybe hurt Elias. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Thorne leaned forward. She's unstable, Your Honor. She's been with more than one man who knows whose kid that is. Elias stood now, his voice low but firm. I know whose he is. He's hers. That's what matters. The judge looked between them, something shifting in his eyes. And you've taken legal guardianship. I've signed papers with the tribal council, recognized by the community. He lives on my land, under my name. There was a long silence. Judge Creel tapped his gavel once more for order than impact. I will take the testimony under review. In the meantime, the child remains with Ms. Isabel Redhawk and her husband. The word husband rang like a bell. As they left the courtroom, Thorne caught up to them outside. His voice was quiet but full of venom. This ain't over, Redhawk. Elias turned, slowly, looked him square in the eye. It never started. Thorne stepped closer to Isabel. You think this is a win? The law moves slow, but it moves. I'll find something. I always do. She didn't back away. Then dig Caleb, but be careful, because you might uncover the man you really are. He flinched at that just enough for her to see it, then turned and walked away. That night back at the ranch, Elias sat beside Tomas's crib, watching the boy breathe. Isabel came in quietly and stood behind him. He's safe for now, she said. Elias nodded. But Thorne won't stop. No, she said, but neither will we. She reached down and touched Tomas's tiny fingers. You think a child can really be claimed by paper and ink? Elias shook his head. A child belongs to who shows up when it counts, who stays, who protects. And that's us now. He looked at her, voice soft. We made that choice the moment we didn't walk away. Out in the night, coyotes called to one another. The wind stirred the dry grass. And inside the little cabin, a woman who once ran from everything sat beside a man who never had. They both knew it would get harder, that Thorne would find new ways to strike. But something had changed. They were no longer surviving. They were standing. The sun hadn't fully risen when Koa came riding hard up the trail, dust streaming behind him like a warning. Elias was splitting wood near the shed, the rhythmic thunk of the axe his only companion. When he saw Koa's face, he stopped mid-swing. Koa didn't bother dismounting. He tossed a folded paper to Elias like it was on fire. He filed the claim. Elias caught it, brows furrowing as he unfolded the document. What claim? Koa's jaw tightened. Water rights. Thorne's petitioned the county to redraw the boundary lines. Says the spring that feeds your land runs from his side of the ridge. Elias scanned the paper. This spring's been on Redhawk land for over 100 years. Doesn't matter. He's got a map, a surveyor, and a judge in his pocket. If this goes through, it won't just dry you out. Half the tribal land will lose access. Our grazing routes, the old wells, the canyon irrigation line, it's all connected. Isabel stepped out of the house, Tomas in her arms. She saw the look on Elias's face and walked faster. What is it now? She asked. Elias handed her the paper. She read it, eyes widening. He's trying to starve us, she said quietly. Not with food, with land. Koa nodded grimly. He's cutting your roots one by one. First the barn, then the boy, now the water. Elias took a breath, steadying the fire building in his chest. We'll fight it. Koa shook his head. This isn't a court case. It's politics. If we don't get ahead of it by the time we're heard, it'll be too late. Later that afternoon, they rode out to the old spring, the heart of the valley. Water trickled clear and cold through the rocks, feeding a stretch of green that split the dry land like a miracle. Willow trees leaned toward the current, and animal tracks crisscrossed the banks. Isabel knelt and dipped her fingers in. This water saved us, she said softly, when Tomas was sick, when I didn't know what would come next. Elias stood beside her, jaw tight. And now he wants to fence it in. Turn a lifeline into leverage. Koa crouched near the edge. If he gets this land, he won't just fence it. He'll poison it, redirect it, block access to everyone without his say-so. Elias looked out over the valley, his voice low but clear. This land remembers who walked it, and it don't belong to men who think they can buy it. That night, Elias called a meeting at the community center in Red Mesa. The room filled with ranchers, elders, and families, people who'd drawn water from the spring their whole lives. Some supported Elias. Others feared Thorne's power. Maggie stood near the back, arms folded. He's trying to bleed us slow, she said. One well at a time. Because bullets leave scars, but legal theft leaves silence. Elias stepped to the front, holding up the claim papers. He's coming for what we built, he said. But water is life, and life isn't his to own. Ben Strongwater rose. You really think we can stop this? He's got friends in the city council, oil men backing him, and the law always listens to money. Koa stood too. We don't fight with money. We fight with history. We dig up every treaty, every record, every ancestor's footprint on this land. We prove this spring fed our people before Thorne's family ever laid a fence. An elder woman, Ada Littlebird, raised her cane. You got my voice. My father built the first pipe to that spring with his bare hands. Others began to murmur in agreement. Years of quiet endurance had finally met their breaking point. We fight together, Elias said, or we all dry up alone. In the following days, the ranch became a hive of activity. Elias and Koa rode out to the archive office in Flagstaff, where they found weathered maps, handwritten water records, and the original land grant given to Elias's great-grandfather. Isabel helped organize names for a petition. Maggie dug up photographs, testimonies, and elder statements. Teenagers from the reservation filmed interviews and posted them to social forums rallying support. The story spread faster than expected. Even a reporter from a Phoenix paper came sniffing around, intrigued by the clash between an oil-backed rancher and a native family fighting for water. But Thorne didn't sit still. One evening, while Elias and Isabel were hauling hay, they returned to find the water flow at the spring slowed to a trickle. Elias followed the dry path upstream and found rocks stacked high. Someone had dammed the flow with fresh earth boards and metal debris. Koa helped him break it down, cursing under his breath. He's not waiting for the court. He's already acting like it's his. Isabel stood over the reopened stream, eyes blazing. He doesn't understand what he's messing with. You don't block a river that's fed generations and think you'll sleep sound. That night, Elias sat outside, oiling his rifle under starlight. Isabel brought him coffee, sitting beside him. He's not going to stop, she said. Elias nodded. Not until we give up, or until we take everything back. She looked at him, voice soft but steady. Then we don't give up. He met her eyes. This fight isn't just about land or water. It's about whether men like him can still decide who deserves to live free. Inside, Tomas stirred in his sleep. Outside, the night held its breath. Because tomorrow they'd ride back to Red Mesa this time, not to argue, but to stand firm before the land board. And Elias knew what had to be said. The truth, not just in paper or maps, but in a voice clear enough to shake walls. The hearing room was packed. Walls lined with folding chairs, fans creaking overhead, and sweat running down the backs of necks in the midsummer heat. At the front sat the county land board, 5 men, 4 of them white. All of them old enough to remember when cattle outnumbered people. Beside them, lawyers, clerks, stacks of dusty maps and water use permits going back 40 years. And then there was Elias Redhawk, standing alone. He wore a clean shirt tucked in. His hair was tied back, his hands calloused, steady at his sides. Isabel sat in the back row, Tomas on her lap, Maggie beside her. Koa stood near the wall like a sentry, arms crossed, jaw locked tight. Across the aisle sat Caleb Thorne, leaning back in his chair, one boot propped lazily over the other. His lawyer, Bryce Cutter, adjusted his tie like the outcome had already been printed. The board chairman cleared his throat. Mr. Redhawk, we've reviewed Thorne's petition regarding water access and land boundaries. Before we vote, you've asked to speak. You may proceed. Elias stepped forward, every footfall deliberate. When he reached the center of the room, he didn't unfold a statement. He didn't glance at notes. He just looked them all in the eye. My name's Elias Redhawk, he began, voice steady. I was born 10 miles from here. Raised by a man who taught me land ain't something you take, it's something you answer to. He glanced toward the back where Isabel sat. She gave the faintest nod. That spring out on my property, he continued. It's not mine. It don't belong to me or any man. It's fed this valley since before borders were drawn, before names were carved into deeds. My people drank from it when there were still buffalo on the plains. And now Thorne wants to call it his because a new map says the ridgeline might bend a different way. There was a murmur among the board members. Elias went on. This ain't about water. It's about control, about one man trying to squeeze out anyone who don't bow to him. You let him win this, and you don't just set a precedent. You damn every rancher, every tribal family, every settler who scraped a living out of this dry earth. He paused. We didn't ask for a fight, but we won't lie down either. One of the board members cleared his throat. Mr. Redhawk, do you have documentation that proves historical usage? Koa stepped forward, then handing over a thick folder of signed petitions, dated maps, and tribal water rights agreements going back nearly a century. The board reviewed them silently. Then Bryce Cutter stood. With all due respect, historical usage isn't ownership. Property lines shift. Laws evolve. Elias turned to face him. Then make a new law. One that protects the land, not just the man who fences it fastest. A flicker of applause stirred the room, quickly silenced by the gavel. As the board recessed to deliberate, Thorne stood and walked past Elias on his way out. You think your little speech changed anything, he muttered. You're still just a man playing house with another man's woman. Elias didn't flinch. You keep thinking Tomas is what'll break her, but you never knew her. Thorne smiled coldly. I don't need to. I only need to prove what she is. That smile stayed with Elias for hours. At sundown, the board returned with their decision. In light of historical evidence and testimony, the chairman said the petition to redraw the water boundary is denied. A rush of relief broke over the room. Koa exhaled. Maggie smiled. Isabel covered her mouth, holding back tears. Even Tomas squealed, unaware of why. But Thorne didn't look surprised. He stood calmly, adjusted his cuffs, and tipped his hat. Guess I'll see you all again soon. Elias watched him go, unease prickling his spine. That night the ranch was quieter than usual. The wind had gone still. The crickets weren't chirping. Something about the silence felt wrong. Elias stayed up late, pacing the perimeter. Isabel came out with coffee and found him near the fence line, rifle across his back. "You're still worried," she said. "He's not done. He lost this round, but he's not the type to let things lie." She handed him the cup. Their fingers touched. "He looked at me today," she said softly. "Not like a man looking at a woman he wants. Like someone holding a secret." Elias turned to her. "What kind of secret?" Isabel stared out at the dark horizon. "The kind you think no one will find out. The kind you bury with your past." She hesitated. "He knows about where I came from. About the border. My papers." Elias's grip tightened on the cup. "You think he'll try to use that against you? I think he already has a plan." The next morning confirmed it. A sheriff's deputy came up the drive with a court summons, not for Elias this time, but for Isabel. Thorne had filed an official complaint questioning her identity, her immigration status, her right to remain in the state. The court date was set in 2 weeks. Isabel stared at the paper for a long moment. Then she sat down on the porch, expression hollow. "I knew it was coming," she said. "I just didn't know how fast." Elias crouched beside her. "Then we get ready. He wants to deport me, split me from Tomas. Then we show them you belong, that you've built something real here." She looked at him, voice thin but fierce. "I won't let him erase me." "You won't," Elias said, "because you're not alone." In the distance, the clouds began to gather. Not the kind that bring rain, the kind that bring reckoning. The sky was low and heavy the morning Isabel left to find Ana Luz. She didn't tell Elias the whole story, just that there was someone who might know more about Tomas's father, someone from the border town where everything had started. He didn't ask questions. He simply saddled the horse, packed her some food, and told her to ride careful. She left before the sun rose, before Tomas was awake enough to miss her. The trail to El Cobre was harsh, winding through mesas and broken ridges. Isabel rode alone, wind stinging her face, dust curling into the folds of her shawl. She hadn't been there in over 2 years. The last time she'd been barefoot, bleeding, clutching Tomas to her chest. A ghost with no name, no plan, only motion. El Cobre hadn't changed much. The edges were still worn, the people still wary. Rusted signs hung over cracked storefronts. Children played in alleys, their laughter mingling with the smell of grilled meat and motor oil. She found Ana Luz behind the counter of a faded bakery near the square. Her dark hair was streaked with gray now, but her eyes were the same, sharp and suspicious. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Ana folded her arms and said flatly, "I told you not to come back." Isabel stepped forward. "I wouldn't if I didn't have to." Ana glanced behind her. The shop was empty. "You're lucky I still own this place," she muttered. "You left a mess behind." "I left to survive." Ana snorted. "That boy still alive?" Isabel nodded. "He's with a good man. Safe. For now." Ana walked around the counter and locked the door. "Why are you here, Isabel? I need something only you have." Ana raised an eyebrow. "Proof," Isabel said. "Proof that Tomas isn't his." Ana's face shifted. "You mean Raúl, yes." Ana turned away, staring out the smudged window. "You think a paper's going to stop a man like Thorne? I think a paper will make it harder for him to lie." Ana was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, walked into the back and returned with a small metal box. She set it on the counter and opened it. Inside were documents, photos, and a few worn letters. She pulled out one, a paternity test done at a clinic south of the border months before Tomas was born. "He forced me to take this," Isabel said, staring at it. Anna nodded. "But he never wanted it public. Too many questions about how you got pregnant, about what happened in that house." Isabel touched the paper. "This proves he's not the father." "It proves he claimed not to be," Anna said carefully. "He paid to have it done, then pretended you were the one who ran." "I need it." Anna hesitated. "You were the only one who believed me," Isabel said. "The only one who helped me escape." "I helped you disappear," Isabel, Anna said. "Not because I believed. Because I knew what men like Raúl did behind closed doors. I've seen enough bruises to stop asking where they came from." Isabel's voice dropped. "He wasn't just cruel. He was connected. That's why I ran." Anna nodded slowly. "And now you're running again." "No," Isabel said. "Now I'm fighting." Anna studied her for a long time, then handed her the paper. "You sure this will help? I don't know," Isabel said. "But it's the only piece I've got left." Anna walked her to the door. "One more thing," she said. "Raúl's dead." Isabel blinked. What Anna nodded. "Over a year ago, car crash. Or maybe someone made it look that way. Either way, he's gone." Isabel stared at the ground, trying to feel something, relief, sadness, rage. But all she felt was the familiar ache of unfinished stories. "Thank you," she said. "You don't owe me thanks. Just don't come back again." Isabel rode hard all the way home. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was dipping low and the wind had picked up. Storm clouds swirled in the distance. Elias met her at the gate. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded and held up the envelope. "I got it." They sat on the porch while Tomas napped inside. Isabel told him everything about Anna, about Raúl, about the test. Elias held the paper in his hands like it was dynamite. "This could end it," he said. "Or it could make him worse. He'll lose in court." "He's not playing for court anymore," Isabel said. "He's playing for pain." Elias looked at her, and in that moment, he didn't see the frightened girl from the road. He saw the woman who'd ridden into her past and brought back a weapon made of truth. "You did what I couldn't," he said. "You faced it." "I had to," she whispered. "Tomas deserves more than silence." They were still on the porch when the first truck arrived. Then another, and another. 3 total. Dust still clinging to their tires, engines rumbling like thunder. Elias stood. Isabel froze. From the first truck stepped Caleb Thorne, flanked by 2 men in suits. He held a file in one hand, waved it like a flag. "You're being served," he called out. "New motion. I'm pressing criminal charges, fraud impersonation, endangering a minor. Seems your wife's been living under a false name." Elias stepped down from the porch. "You don't know when to quit." "Oh, I'm just getting started," Thorne said. "You think you can hide behind tribal land, behind pity stories and dirt floor honesty. This is about the law now." Isabel stood beside Elias, voice clear and calm. "Then let the law see this." She held up the envelope high enough for him to see. Thorne's face twitched. "You wouldn't." "It's already filed," she said. "You're not the father, and the only thing you ever owned was your own lies." Thorne stepped forward, face flushed. "You'll regret this." Elias raised his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "No, Thorne. The only thing we regret is thinking men like you could be reasoned with." The men in suits exchanged looks. One of them took the envelope from Isabel and scanned the document inside. "This changes things," he muttered to Thorne. "You think this is over?" Thorne growled. "It's ending," Elias said. "Right here. Right now." Thorne stared at him for a long beat. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, slamming the door behind him. The engine's roared tires kicked up dust, and they were gone. For now. But everyone knew the final blow hadn't landed yet. Not until the courtroom. The courtroom smelled of old wood and older grudges. Morning light streamed through tall windows, but it did nothing to ease the weight in the air. Everyone from Red Mesa seemed to be there, ranchers in faded hats, tribal elders in worn boots, and families who whispered as they sat down, eyes locked on the front of the room. At the plaintiff's table sat Caleb Thorne, sharp-suited, smug fingers tapping against the table like he already owned the verdict. His lawyer, Bryce Cutter, whispered something to him, and Thorne smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd lost once and promised himself he wouldn't again. At the defense table sat Elias and Isabel. She wore a plain dress, no makeup, no jewelry. Her hands were folded in her lap, but there was no trembling. Elias sat beside her, his presence quiet and solid as stone. Tomas wasn't in the room, Maggie was watching him, but the idea of him hung there like breath on glass. Judge Creel entered, robes dragging across the floor. He looked tired, like the weight of too many years had finally settled on his back. "This is a hearing regarding the custody and identity of the child known as Tomas," he said, "and allegations of fraud, endangerment, and perjury against Isabel Redhawk. Let us proceed." The prosecution went first. Cutter stood adjusting his tie and started laying it out. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court, today we expose a lie. A woman with no papers, no history, no verified name who arrived in this country under false pretenses and has continued to deceive the community she lives in." He turned to the jury. "We're not here to argue whether she's a good person. We're here to decide if she's a legal one." Elias tensed beside Isabel, but she didn't move. Cutter continued painting Isabel as a drifter, someone who'd latched onto Elias and fabricated a new life. He brought up the paternity dispute, the false name on hospital records, the undocumented border crossing. He made it sound like survival was a crime. Isabel kept her eyes forward, jaw tight. Then Cutter called his witness. Thorne took the stand with the swagger of a man who'd been rehearsing for this moment all his life. "I knew her back when she worked for me," he said. "She was always secretive, never gave a straight answer about where she was from. I tried to help her, gave her work, food, shelter." He paused as if waiting for the courtroom to applaud. But then she ran, took a kid that might not even be hers, showed up in another man's house pretending to be his wife. He looked at Isabel. "She's dangerous, and she doesn't belong here." Isabel didn't look away. Neither did Elias. When it was the defense's turn, their lawyer, a lean Navajo woman named Sarah Begay, stood and walked slowly to the front. "My client didn't come here to deceive," she said. "She came here to survive. She's not asking for charity. She's asking for justice." She called Isabel to the stand. The courtroom went silent as she walked up, every bootstep like thunder. Sarah stepped aside. "Tell us your name." Isabel took a breath. "My name is Isabel Luna Redhawk. Is that the name you were born with?" "No." She looked at the judge. "But it's the name I chose, and the one I earned." Sarah nodded. "Tell us about the day you left." Isabel spoke quietly, but the room leaned in. "I worked in a house I wasn't allowed to leave. I cooked, cleaned, and kept quiet because I didn't know what would happen if I didn't. I got pregnant. When I found out the man I worked for told me I was lying, that no one would believe me, that I was nothing. So I ran. She looked directly at Thorne now, and I never looked back. Sarah handed her a document. Do you recognize this? Isabel nodded. It's a paternity test. From before my son was born. The man I worked for made me take it. It proved he wasn't the father, but he never used it. Because the truth didn't serve him. Sarah looked to the judge. This test has been verified. The results match the timeline. It confirms that Caleb Thorne has no biological connection to Tomas. None. A quiet wave rippled through the courtroom. Sarah continued, and since then my client has done nothing but raise this child. Feed him, clothe him, love him. With the help of her husband, Elias Redhawk. She may not have the documents some folks want, but what she has is everything that matters. She paused. Love, grit, and truth. When the judge gave Thorne the chance to respond, he rose again. It's all too convenient. She shows up with a test that no one saw until now, from another country. We don't know if it's real, but Creel raised a hand. That's enough, Mr. Thorne. The evidence has been verified. Then the judge looked at Isabel. You were afraid, he said. Yes, she answered. And now she looked at Elias, at the people behind her. I'm not anymore. That afternoon, after a long deliberation, Judge Creel returned. He didn't look at anyone when he spoke. This court finds that the accusations against Isabel Redhawk are unsubstantiated. Her actions while outside legal norms were rooted in survival, not malice. He paused. Furthermore, the court recognizes Elias and Isabel Redhawk as the legal guardians of Tomas. Full custody is granted. Motion for deportation is denied. Elias closed his eyes. Isabel gripped his hand. Somewhere in the back, Maggie let out a sharp, relieved breath. But Thorne didn't move. He just sat there still as stone. When the court adjourned, Elias stood and turned to Thorne. This was never about winning, he said. It was about telling the truth loud enough that even you couldn't talk over it. Thorne rose slowly. You think this is justice? Elias leaned in. No, but it's a start. Outside, the town gathered. People clapped backs, offered quiet congratulations. For the first time in a long time, the Redhawks stood without shadow. But peace never comes clean. As the sun dipped low, Koa stepped through the crowd, face grim. He's not finished, he said quietly. Elias stiffened. What now? Thorne sold the canyon land. To developers. The spring's upstream source. It's already fenced. Isabel's heart dropped. He couldn't beat us in court, so now he's going after the land again. Elias's eyes hardened. Then we stop him, once and for all. They rode before dawn. Elias led the way, rifle strapped across his back, his silhouette outlined by the soft gray light breaking over the hills. Isabel followed close behind, wrapped in a wool shawl. Tomas nestled tight against her back. Koa brought up the rear eyes, scanning the trail, every sense on alert. They didn't speak much. Words weren't needed. This ride wasn't about anger anymore. It wasn't even about winning. It was about protecting what they had built, what they had chosen. The canyon came into view as the sun crested the ridge. Morning light spilled across the red stone cliffs and scattered mesquite, revealing a cold truth: the land had already been touched. Heavy machinery sat near the mouth of the spring. A chain-link fence, half erected, gleamed like a wound across the earth. A white sign with black lettering read, "Private Property Future, Site of Canyon Falls Resort." Elias dismounted first, walking to the fence and gripping it with both hands. The spring, his grandfather's spring, bubbled weakly behind the barrier, its source throttled by a concrete pipe. "They've already diverted it," he said, voice low. Koa kicked a loose stone. "He must have made the deal right after the custody ruling, while we were in court." Isabel dismounted and unwrapped Tomas from the sling. He blinked in the light, then reached for a leaf blowing by. "This was his plan all along," she said. "Not just to break us, but to erase everything." Koa looked at Elias. "We could cut through, tear the fence down, but tomorrow they'll be back with trucks and more men." Elias was silent. His eyes scanned the canyon walls. The wind moved through the trees like an old voice. "No," he said finally. "We do it right. We bring everyone." Within 24 hours, word had spread. By the next morning, over 50 people stood at the fence. Elders, children, ranchers, and young activists from nearby towns. Families brought tents. Others brought coffee drums, flags. A few held up signs painted with words that burned, "Water is not for sale." The land remembers. We are still here. Thorne arrived on the third day. He pulled up in a black truck, sunglasses on, expression unreadable. A construction manager followed behind, nervous. "You're trespassing," Thorne called out. "This is private land." Elias stepped forward. "You bought it with dirty deals. You don't own the water. You don't own the people." Thorne's smile was cold. "You think a protest will stop development?" Isabel walked up beside Elias Tomas on her hip. "It's not a protest," she said. "It's a return." Thorne looked around at the crowd, at the cameras, some of them held at the reporters, who had started to trickle in. "You can't stop progress." Elias stepped forward until they were nearly nose to nose. "Progress doesn't come by bulldozing memory." Thorne didn't respond. He turned, climbed back in his truck, and peeled away. But the machines never returned. That night under stars so clear it made your bones ache. Elias sat beside the fire with Tomas on his lap. Isabel leaned against him, watching the flames. "You remember when I showed up?" she asked quietly. Elias smiled, like it was yesterday. "I didn't have anything. No name that mattered. No safety. Just a boy and a prayer." Elias looked down at Tomas, now dozing softly. "You had more than that," he said. "You had fight." She nodded. "I still do. But I never thought it'd feel like home." "It is home. For all of us." A few feet away, Koa played a soft rhythm on an old cedar drum. Maggie passed around cornbread. Elders told stories about the spring, how it fed horses in dry years, how its sound helped babies sleep. By morning, the state water board had issued a temporary protection order on the canyon, citing cultural and environmental concerns. More hearings were scheduled. Lawyers from the tribe began preparing a case. But the truth was the real victory had already happened. Not in the courts, but in the stand. The spring remained untouched. The fence was quietly removed. And slowly the land began to heal. Elias rebuilt the barn. Tomas learned to ride a pony named Sugarfoot. Isabel planted lavender beside the porch. And every so often folks from Red Mesa would come by, drop off pie off or help with fencing, share a meal. They didn't ask questions about the past. They just stayed long enough to remind the Redhawks that the community was watching now, protecting. One evening, as cicadas sang in the trees and dusk settled over the valley, Isabel stood at the edge of the spring watching Tomas play in the shallow water. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You all right?" he asked. She leaned back into him. "I think I finally am." He kissed her temple. "You know," she said, "for a long time I thought freedom meant leaving everything behind. And now I know freedom is something you grow into, like roots." She turned to face him. "And love. Love isn't the prize at the end. It's the reason you survive long enough to find it." They stood there for a long while, the spring gurgling nearby, the air warm and still. And far off, past the hills and fences and deeds, the wind carried a whisper, a story passed down from soil to soul, about a woman who ran a man who stayed, and the boy they raised between scars and sunrise. A story that didn't begin with tragedy or end with triumph, but settled instead quiet and whole in the place they chose to call home, where love wasn't taken, it was made, and no one could take it back.